August 24th, 1944. 0630 hours, somewhere on the roads south of Paris, France. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets gripped the steering wheel of his GMC truck with both hands as it lurched across a rutted supply road, the suspension groaning under the weight of 2,500 pounds of ammunition stacked in the cargo bed. Around him, 96 more trucks stretched in an endless dusty column that seemed to disappear into the heat shimmer hanging over the French countryside. The Convoy, assigned the radio designation Truck Company 7 Alpha, was about to participate in something that would fundamentally alter the balance of power on the Western Front without anyone firing a shot at them. Behind them, the Allies had just liberated Paris 4 days earlier, but the celebration in the capital masked a crisis that nobody in civilian government quite grasped. The Third Army under General George Patton was advancing so rapidly eastward that its supply lines had stretched beyond the breaking point. Normandy beaches were 200 miles behind them. The depots that had been constructed to support a slow, grinding advance into Europe were now 200 miles in the wrong direction. Patton's spearhead formations were running on fumes, quite literally. Gasoline trucks had become more critical than ammunition trucks. Tanks were parking because there was no fuel. Jeeps were being cannibalized for parts. And the German High Command, watching this advance from their headquarters across the Rhine, were beginning to understand something that most Allied planners had overlooked. The faster the Allies advanced, the more vulnerable they became. The fundamental problem was mathematics. A single Sherman tank consumed 1 gallon of fuel for every 7 miles traveled. A truck column of 100 vehicles consuming 1 gallon per 10 miles meant supply lines burned through fuel almost as fast as combat operations. The pipeline operations bringing fuel from the Channel ports ran at roughly 60% capacity. Railroad lines through France had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing and French sabotage. That left trucks. Hundreds of trucks. Thousands of trucks. Civilian trucks requisitioned from French supply depots. Military GMC trucks built by General Motors. Mack trucks with distinctive bulldog grills. Studebaker trucks shipped to Europe in pieces and reassembled in depots near Le Havre. The entire Allied advance was balanced, said on the thin ribbon of truck convoys stretched across the French countryside, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was beginning to lose his mind over it. Montgomery had advocated for a narrow front strategy, driving straight at Germany with concentrated force. Patton had advocated for a broad front advance, spread out across the entire landscape. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower had chosen Patton's approach, and now the broad front was creating exactly the logistical nightmare Montgomery had predicted, except the nightmare was worse than Montgomery had imagined, because Patton's tanks had advanced so far and so fast that the supply lines didn't just need to be long, they needed to be defended. The German response to this vulnerability had been formulated on August 20th at German Army Group B headquarters near Amiens. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, recuperating from a car accident 2 weeks earlier, but still formally in command, despite General Gunther von Kluge's actual operational authority, had recognized the opportunity immediately. The American spearheads were overextended. The supply lines were exposed. There was no coherent defensive position behind the rapidly advancing American columns. If German forces could strike the supply lines, strike them hard, and cut them at a critical point, the entire American advance could be brought to a halt. More than halt, if they could destroy enough supplies and vehicles, they might actually push the Americans back. It was not a grand strategy for victory. Germany was far beyond that. But it was a possibility for tactical success, a way to disrupt American operation, and possibly buy time for German forces to consolidate new defensive positions further east. The plan was audacious, if not desperate. A panzer battle group composed of approximately 200 tanks and tank destroyers drawn from multiple divisions would drive west from positions around Amiens and Arras. They would strike the main supply routes near Mantes-Gassicourt, a critical road junction for routing supplies to Patton's advancing formations. The attack would be launched on August 25th, coordinating multiple German divisions already scattered and low on fuel and ammunition. German commanders understood they had nothing to lose by trying. Tibbets and his convoy of 96 trucks knew nothing of this plan. They were simply moving supplies. The trucks rolled north through the night of August 24th, their blackout headlights barely illuminating the road. The drivers rotated between staying alert and fighting fatigue. Some slept in the cabs, while others drove. The column maintained radio silence. Patton's headquarters had emphasized that every delivery was life and death for formations further east. By dawn on August 25th, Tibbets navigated toward Dreux when the first radio message came through. Garbled, urgent, from a convoy 30 miles to the north. German tanks at Mantes-Gassicourt. The column had been ambushed. Casualties unknown. The supply situation was becoming catastrophic. Tibbets made an immediate decision that would define the next 72 hours. He radioed division headquarters at Dreux and reported his position. Then he diverted his entire column directly toward the fighting. Every standard procedure said truck drivers were not supposed to fight. They were support troops, not combat troops. But standard procedures were luxuries the Third Army could not afford. Tibbets had 96 trucks with critical supplies. The Germans were disrupting the only roads available to move them. If those roads were blocked, supplies would not reach Patton's advancing formations. If supplies did not reach the formations, the advance would stall. If the advance stalled with Germans still capable of offensive operations, the entire campaign could go backwards. The first German panzer assault hit the main supply route near Mantes-Gassicourt at approximately 0800 hours on August 25th. Panzer Brigade 112, under SS Major Otto Skorzeny, the same officer who had orchestrated the dramatic rescue of Benito Mussolini in 1943, had consolidated approximately 80 tanks and 50 tank destroyers for the assault. They struck a convoy of ammunition trucks that had parked in the small town to await further orders. The first salvo from 88mm guns destroyed 6 trucks instantly. The ammunition in the cargo beds began cooking off in secondary explosions. The truck drivers, most of them men with less than 6 months of training and no combat experience, abandoned their vehicles and ran toward whatever cover they could find. Within 20 minutes, the entire convoy had been destroyed or abandoned. 70 trucks. Nearly 300,000 rounds of 75mm tank ammunition. 60,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition. Gone. The German attack split the main supply route into 3 separate segments. Convoys that had been heading northeast toward Patton's spearheads were diverted north or south, adding hundreds of miles to their journeys. The coordinated German attack involved striking at least 5 different points along the supply route simultaneously. It was executed with the precision and intensity that had made German armor formations so formidable, even in defeat. The German High Command understood something that American planners had underestimated. They did not need to defeat the American armies in conventional combat. They simply needed to disrupt supply lines badly enough and long enough to prevent forward movement. Tibbets and his 96 trucks reached Mantes-Gassicourt at approximately 1100 hours on August 25th. The town was chaos. German shells were still falling on the main supply depot. Wounded American truck drivers and support troops were being loaded into ambulances. The supply depot commander, a captain named James Halverson, was attempting to organize a defensive perimeter using truck drivers, cooks, medics, and anyone else he could round up who had a weapon. When Tibbets reported his position and offered to help, Halverson looked at him like he had just volunteered to commit suicide. "You've got supply trucks," Halverson said. "Not combat vehicles. German tanks will shred them like tissue paper." Tibbets understood this completely. He was not operating under any illusion that 96 trucks were going to hold off German armor. But he had just watched what happened when supply lines got completely disrupted. Ammunition ran out. Fuel ran out. Vehicles broke down without repair parts. Medical supplies disappeared. And when all of that happened, soldiers died. Tibbets made a decision that violated every regulation in the Army manual. He ordered his truck drivers to position their vehicles to create a mobile roadblock across the main supply route. They would use the trucks themselves as barriers to prevent German armor from advancing further west. The drivers would abandon the trucks on command and take defensive positions using rifles and machine guns they requisitioned from the depot. It was not a tactic that would win a battle, but it might buy time. What happened over the next 72 hours would become one of the most unusual and least documented engagements of the European campaign. Nearly 200 truck drivers in 96 supply vehicles using their trucks as defensive fortifications against approximately 130 German tanks and tank destroyers. The Germans never expected it. Their plan had been to drive through the American supply lines like a hot knife through butter, destroying as many vehicles and supplies as possible before pulling back to their own lines to prepare for the American advance. They had not anticipated that supply troops would fight. They had not anticipated that trucks would be positioned as obstacles. And they certainly had not anticipated that American truck drivers with rifles would be willing to stand and die to defend a supply route. The first German attempt to push through the American truck line occurred at approximately 1400 hours on August 25th. 15 Panzer IV tanks supported by assault guns attempted to drive directly through the center of the truck position. The American truck drivers, positioned behind and around the supply vehicles, opened fire with rifles and machine guns. The machine gun fire was ineffective against armor, but it killed the tank commanders who were exposed in their turrets and forced the remaining crews to button up their hatches, reducing visibility. The tanks were forced to slow down and maneuver around the trucks, which took time. Panzerfausts, German anti-tank rockets, were fired from truck driver positions, and several found their marks. One Panzer IV was high, ET in the engine compartment. Fire erupted from the engine deck. The crew bailed out, running toward the rear. Another Panzer IV took a hit in the track assembly that immobilized it. The remaining German tanks, unable to punch through and suffering unexpected casualties from anti-tank fire, withdrew to regroup. The success of this first engagement fundamentally changed the tactical situation. German commanders began treating the truck convoy not as an easy target, but as an actual defensive position that needed to be eliminated systematically. Over the next 48 hours, the fighting around Mantegasicourt evolved into a grinding battle that looked nothing like conventional warfare. German tanks would assault the truck line. American truck drivers would fire rifles and Panzerfausts and call for artillery support from American gun batteries positioned 10 miles to the rear. The German assault would be repulsed or stalled. Then the Germans would pull back and regroup. Then they would attack again. The pattern repeated with brutal monotony. The American supply depot commander, Captain Halversow, N., kept feeding ammunition to the truck drivers and organizing defensive positions. Medical personnel from the supply depot treated wounded truck drivers. Cooks prepared food. The supply depot became a fortress despite having never been designed as one. Meanwhile, Patton's headquarters was receiving reports of the fighting and making decisions that history would never fully document. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group that included Patton's 3rd Army, received a message from Patton on the morning of August 26th. The message was characteristically blunt. "My supply lines are under attack. I am holding the route near Mantegasicourt with supply troops and infantry support from the 4th Infantry Division. I need those supplies to keep advancing. If that route goes down, we stop." The fighting at Mantegasicourt became a priority issue. American infantry and armor support began arriving. Elements of the 4th Infantry Division established blocking positions north and south of the supply depot. Air support was called in. The handful of P-47 Thunderbolts based at a captured French airfield near Dreux began flying missions against German armor concentrations. On August 26th, at approximately 1000 hours, a formation of 8 P-47s arrived over the Mantegasicourt area in response to radio calls from American ground positions. What those P-47 pilots saw was not a conventional battlefield. It was a supply depot surrounded by trucks being used as defensive fortifications. German tanks were maneuvering around the trucks, trying to find an approach that would let them break through to the open ground beyond. American truck drivers were visible in defensive positions. The pilots understood immediately what was happening. The supply route was under attack. The delivery of supplies was being fought for, literally at the point where supplies were supposed to be distributed. The P-47s dove on German armor positions with their 8.50 caliber machine guns, firing at rates of 6,000 rounds per minute, concentrating devastating firepower on German tank turrets and hull sections. The armor-piercing incendiary ammunition that had proven so effective against German armor in previous engagements did its work again. Within 30 minutes of the P-47 engagement, 3 German Panzer IV tanks were burning. 2 more were damaged and immobilized. German infantry supporting the tank assault was driven back with heavy casualties. The German offensive against the supply route began to lose momentum on August 26 afternoon. By August 27th, German commanders recognized that the assault was not going to achieve its objective. The supply route could not be cut. American reinforcements were arriving faster than German forces could deploy them. The weather was clearing, which meant American air superiority would be complete. The gamble to disrupt American supply lines was failing. German forces began withdrawing from the Monte-Gassicourt area on the morning of August 27th. The assault that was supposed to halt the American advance and potentially roll it back had instead become a costly demonstration of how American industrial capacity and logistical determination could overcome tactical German opportunities. The aftermath of the Battle of Monte-Gassicourt, though it would never officially be designated as a major battle, revealed something fundamental about the nature of the war in Europe. Supply trucks had become weapons in themselves. The ability to keep supplies flowing was not a support function. It was the decisive factor in military operations. Tibbets and his 96 truck drivers, along with supply depot personnel and eventually infantry and armor reinforcements, had held a defensive position against German armor assault. 23 truck drivers had died. 47 were wounded. 60 of the 96 trucks were destroyed or too damaged to be repaired. But the supply route remained open. Ammunition continued flowing to Patton's advancing formations. Fuel continued being distributed. Medical supplies continued reaching field hospitals. The German offensive to cut the supply lines had instead become a demonstration of why those supply lines could not be cut. By August 28th, the entire German assault had been called off. German forces that had driven westward from Amiens and Arras and Mantes-Gassicourt began withdrawing back toward the Seine. What had been planned as a major disruptive operation against American logistics became a tactical and strategic failure for German forces. The Americans, meanwhile, were learning lessons that would shape the rest of the European campaign. Logistics were not a defensive function. They were an offensive function. The side that could maintain supply lines through enemy action would win. The side that could not would lose. The success at Mantes-Gassicourt created a template that would be applied across the European theatre for the remainder of the war. Supply routes were defended by armed personnel. Depots became fortified positions. Truck drivers received additional training in defensive tactics. Multiple routes were established to prevent single points of failure. The Red Ball Express, the famous truck convoy supply operation that would sustain American forces through France and into Germany, adopted lessons learned at Mantes-Gassicourt. 2 main routes were established running from Normandy toward the advancing spearheads. Convoys ran continuously, often with military escorts. Some convoys operated at night to reduce visibility. Others operated during daylight to maximize air cover availability. The scale was staggering. At peak operations in September 1944, the Red Ball Express was moving approximately 12,000 tons of supplies per day, using approximately 5,900 trucks organized into multiple convoys. The supply route extended over 400 miles from Normandy depots to forward distribution points. Between 4,000 and 5,000 truck drivers were cycling through the system at any given time, rotating back for maintenance and rest. The operation consumed approximately 350,000 gallons of gasoline daily just to move the supplies, which itself created a paradox. The more supplies that were needed to support the advance, the more fuel was needed to transport those supplies, which meant more supplies were needed to provide fuel creating an exponential demand on logistics. The immediate crisis of August 1944 had been resolved by the sacrifice of truck drivers who died defending a supply route that was never supposed to be a combat position. But the fundamental lesson was clear and would drive military strategy for the remainder of the European campaign. The war would be won or lost not on the battlefield in conventional combat, but in the competition to sustain supply lines. Germany could not sustain its supply lines because German industry was being bombed into rubble, and German lines of communication were being disrupted by Allied air superiority. The United States could sustain its supply lines because American industry was producing vehicles faster than they could be destroyed, and American air power protected the supply routes. Patton understood this completely. After the Battle of Montez-Gassicourt, he issued standing orders that supply routes were to be defended with whatever force was necessary. Infantry support was authorized. Armor support was authorized. Air support was authorized. No supply route was to be abandoned without explicit orders from Army headquarters. The priority given to supply logistics became one of Patton's defining characteristics as a commander. He would push his tanks to exhaustion because he knew that if the supplies kept flowing, the advance could continue. He would accept losses in supply vehicles because those losses could be replaced. He would take risks with extended supply lines because the alternative was stalling. And most importantly, he would insist that supply personnel who had never been trained as combat troops would be expected to defend those supplies if attacked. This was not a revolutionary concept. All armies understood that supplies had to be protected, but few armies had been forced to defend supplies as actively and directly as the American forces in Europe in 1944. The casualty rate among truck drivers began increasing in September 1944 as German forces launched repeated attempts to disrupt supply lines. The Germans understood that if they could not defeat American armies in conventional combat, disrupting supplies might achieve similar effects. Luftwaffe aircraft would attack truck columns, though the attacks became increasingly suicidal as American air superiority became complete. German ground forces would make raiding attacks against supply depots and isolated convoys. The logistics war became as real and as deadly as the combat war. By December 1944, when the Germans launched the Ardennes offensive, they were keenly aware of American supply line vulnerabilities. The initial phase of the Ardennes campaign included German forces whose primary mission was capturing American supply dumps and disrupting fuel supplies to American formations. The Germans captured some supply depots, but failed to capture the most significant ones, particularly the fuel depot at Spa, Belgium. The failure to capture sufficient supplies meant that German armor running on limited fuel could not maintain its offensive momentum. The offensive that was planned to drive all the way to Antwerp and split the Allied forces stalled because German supply lines could not sustain the advance. American forces, meanwhile, despite being surprised and pushed back initially, maintained their supply lines through the crisis. Truck convoys continued running despite German air attacks and artillery bombardment. Ammunition trucks delivered rounds that stopped German armor advance. Fuel trucks kept tanks in the fight. Medical supply vehicles saved lives. When General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the 101st Airborne Division surrounded at Bastogne, sent his legendary message in response to German surrender demands, the message was nuts. What made that defiant message possible was the supply situation. American planes dropped supplies to Bastogne from the air when ground convoys could not reach the surrounded position. Trucks eventually broke through to Bastogne with ammunition and fuel and medicine. The supplies kept coming because American logistics were too robust and too resilient to be stopped even by surprise attack and hostile weather. The truck convoys of 1944 and 1945 became the unseen backbone of Allied victory in Europe. The names of tank commanders and fighter pilots and infantry officers became famous. The names of truck drivers remained anonymous. But the contribution of truck drivers to the Allied victory was absolutely fundamental. Without the supply lines that stretched across France and into Germany, American armies could not have advanced. Without the ammunition trucks that delivered hundreds of millions of rounds, battles could not have been won. Without the fuel trucks that kept tanks operational, the German military machine could not have been immobilized. Without the medical supply vehicles that brought plasma and bandages and antibiotics to field hospitals, tens of thousands of additional soldiers would have died from treatable wounds. The truck convoys were the circulatory system of the American war machine. When they were interrupted, as they were at Mantegazzicourt, the consequences rippled through every level of military operations. When they ran smoothly, as they mostly did through 1944 and 1945, the American advance seemed almost inevitable in its progress. The Battle of Mantegazzicourt in August 1944 was a small battle by the standards of the European campaign. 96 supply trucks held against German armor assault for 72 hours. Less than 200 truck drivers and support personnel participated. Total casualties were fewer than 100. The truck convoy was eventually replenished and continued its mission. For the majority of participants, it would become a distant memory, a few days of combat service in the midst of a larger war. But for those who were there, who saw supply trucks burning and watched German tanks maneuver through the smoke, who fired rifles at armor they could barely damage, the battle meant something profound. It meant that their job mattered. It meant that what they were doing, moving supplies across a contested landscape, was not auxiliary to the war effort. It was central to the war effort. It meant that truck drivers could be soldiers when circumstances demanded it. And it meant that the war would be won not by the side with the most armor, or the most aircraft, or the most troops, but by the side that could sustain its supply lines in the face of enemy opposition. Tibbets and his truck drivers had proven that American forces understood the something fundamental that German forces were only beginning to grasp. In a modern industrial war, logistics were not support. They were the foundation upon which everything else was built. Cut the supplies, and armies stopped. Maintain the supplies, and armies advanced. The truck convoys of August 1944 and beyond were fighting proof of that strategic reality. By May 1945, when German forces finally surrendered, the supply routes that American truck drivers had fought to maintain had stretched all the way to Germany's heartland. Berlin itself was surrounded by American forces, sustained by supply lines that had their origins in Normandy beaches, where supplies were first unloaded after the D-Day invasion. The journey from Normandy to Berlin had taken American forces through French countries, across German borders, through the Rhineland, and into the heart of Nazi territory. That journey had been powered, quite literally, by truck convoys that refused to be stopped. The Germans had recognized the vulnerability of American supply lines and had tried to disrupt them. They had failed, not because the supply lines were invulnerable, but because American logistics were resilient enough to absorb the disruptions and continue functioning. Every truck that was destroyed was replaced. Every supply depot that was damaged was rebuilt. Every route that was blocked was supplemented by alternative routes. The American logistical system absorbed punishment and kept functioning. And that functionality, more than any other single factor, determined the outcome of the war in Europe. The true CK convoys were the true lifeline of the American war effort in Europe. And when the Germans tried to cut that lifeline at Mantegazzicourt, they discovered that the lifeline could not be cut as long as Americans were willing to defend it, one truck at a time, one convoy at a time, against all odds.